Alrighty, Owen. I'm going to be going through a bunch of the literature review things, pointing out some information that I need, things that either were not present in the original studies or things that this gentleman had conveniently left out. It's very possible that he left them out because he didn't feel that these things were relevant. Given a lot of the things that he's saying about the moment arm analysis of a squat, he doesn't really know what's going on, especially whenever we consider what he's talking about in regards to traditional versus non-traditional squats. So we're just going to go to the first one. This is Tutungi et al. Hopefully I said that right. This guy, he's talking about the ACL and the PCL, their function in the squat. Nothing here is really groundbreaking or frankly really relevant. It's like if you're letting your knee slide forward significantly with a vertical torso, the hamstring is not going to be pulling in a posterior direction on the tibia. So therefore the PCL is going to be doing more of the work. And then he goes on to talk about doing squats on a descended board or a decline board, excuse me, here we go. Decline board compared to the horizontal surface, the forces on the patellar tendon as well as the PCL were higher. Yes, they will be. It's like, because to do this, you have to keep a vertical torso, or, if the bar were to be sitting on your hips, it would provide more of a counterweight for you. And it's like, none of this information to me is particularly insightful or frankly very relevant. So it's like patellar forces were 20 to 30% higher during the eccentric squat on a decline board. Yes, this is because the knee is farther forward of the ankle, more of the loading is shared there, less of the moment is on the hip. Unsure as to why this is either contra or a counter indicating the moment model or what. Then we talk about the forward lean is characteristic of a non-traditional squat. And then if we even go down to his version of a non-traditional squat, his diagnostic back angles are basically exactly the same. So if we zoom into, where did we go? Did we miss him? Oh no, we missed him. That's results section. Here we go. All right, so we're on page 31. So if we have the lowest point during his non-traditional squat, or during his traditional squat, his toes are not abducted. The bar is on the top of his traps. The chest is relatively vertical, but if we had him perfectly at the plane of the side, then we had a distance between the bar. His centroid is going to be a few inches south of that, because most of these guys in his primary study were around 71 to 80 kilos, and then their 10 RM weight was also around 80 kilos. So if they're using 65 to 70% of this, the centroid is not going to be replaced by the barbell. The centroid is going to be replaced, or the center of gravity of the system, when I'm saying centroid, is going to be slightly south and then more closer to the hips. So it's like this horizontal distance between the barbell and the hip, it's actually quite similar to whenever we're here, okay? Because again, the centroid is going to be the combination of the barbell's weight and the lifter's weight. And in this position, when the barbell is going to be substantially lighter than the lifter, because again, these are relatively smaller guys with relatively smaller loads, because again, it was 65 to 70% of a 10 RM load, it's going to be about closer to here, really. So it's really going to be over the toes, because if it was forward of the toes, if his centroid was forward of the center of pressure, he would just have to walk forward. So it's just like the machine is pretty self-organizing, and then the results are fairly in line with that. So that's one of the primary reasons that this was irking me for his content. But if we can establish that his content is kind of retarded, then whatever. So we can just continue on with the literature review. Here's a fun one when he says, talking about when performing an exercise review, correcting muscles and balances is important to a well-rounded exercise routine. That's cute. Bilateral net torsus torque, yada, yada, yada. I don't really care about that. Here we go. This was good. I see her. Okay. Minimal hamstring activity placed a low demand on the hamstring muscles to counter anterior shearing forces on the proximal tibia. If there aren't a lot of anterior forces on the proximal tibia, that means that the tibia, where can I draw this at? Let's pull this up. We're going to use this area as a little sketching area. So, boop, 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 boop. Okay, so if this is our squatting guy, he has the bar right here. Actually, his femur's incredibly long. This is why drawing is difficult on the computer. Okay, that's a better femur. This guy's kind of a long torso, but we won't worry about that too much. Okay, and then we have the shin angle. We have this. Forgive the fact that his toe is inclined. The bar is going to be at this top corner of the square. The centroid is going to be, again, the combined center, so that's going to be slightly lower than that. This is going to intersect the middle of the foot basically here. So in our moment arm analysis, the moment on the knee is going to be that forward of the center of gravity, or the resultant force vector from the combined centroid. And then we have the moment arm on the hip. Now at this point, if we have the hamstrings connecting at the ischial tuberosity down here, wrapping around to the front of the tibia, the torso angle is going to incredibly dictate the hamstring activity. So if, let's say, if my hamstring, let's go back to this, if my hamstring were to be here instead of here, so this is the position that I'm advocating for it to be in. If the torso is here, now we've either, broken our spine or we've rotated our pelvis, and by rotating our pelvis, we have shortened our hamstring groups outside of the short hip. So we don't need to be too pedantic there. So essentially, it's just like if you're doing a more knee-dominant squat and your knees go all the way forward out to here, or even let's say another inch, and there's less moment on your hips, that means that to contain the bar in the same position, the torso has to be more vertical. And since these people are all doing basically high bar squats, the torso is going to be longer, the chest is going to be more vertical, the knees are going to go more forward, and the hamstring activity is going to be more minimal. The moment arm analysis of the squat seems to be incredibly reflective of the EMG data they're getting, which is why I'm not entirely sure that it's, super useful. Research in order to refute the co-contraction hypothesis in the hamstring and the quadriceps. So if the quadriceps are responsible for all really vertical displacement of anything above the knee, and the hamstrings are now suddenly responsible for anchoring the back angle can still be anchored. The quadriceps can and do still extend while the hamstrings are still doing their jobs. A lot of the language in here seems to indicate it's just like the hamstrings are just kind of flopping around while the quads do their business. And again, I think that's just because of misconception of what the squat should be, or the squat as confirmed by the starting strength moment arm analysis. And again, 75% of their 10 rep max load, so I guess he's using some similar protocols to what we have here. Here we go. We'll scroll down a little bit in this. The effective stance width and bar load, yes, so a narrow stance, 75% of shoulder width, wider stance, 140% of shoulder width, and then two loads, so 60 and 75% of 1 RM. The biceps femoris demonstrated no increase in muscle activity. Again, just like we talked about before, let's say even if we piled them on with 120% of their 1 RM, that would likely change their torso angle. If you look at heavier squats, the heavier the squats tend to be with the same lifter, the torso angle tends to get more depressed. So a lot of people talk about the chest fall pattern in powerlifting. That's what that is. The bar's too heavy, you start to lean over more. The difference is, like in the starting strength moment arm analysis, we want you to bend over more so the torso and the hamstrings, the erectors, and the glutes can be doing more work in the first place. Because again, it's not a powerlifting squat. It is we want the most amount of muscle doing the most amount of things over the most amount of time and space. We have no indication as to any level of abduction from the toes, see if the toe angle is out or if the knees are going to be shoved out as well. That's from the sagittal plane is going to affect basically the length of the femur when you're doing your moment arm analysis. So it's like these people could be having their toes directly forward, not shoving their knees out, having very long femurs, or they could be shoving them out dramatically wide. Most people end up being, somewhere between like 15 to 45 degrees on the toe angle. And then again, that's going to affect the femur length, which is in turn going to affect the torso angle. So it's one of those things where it's just like, okay, congratulations, the biceps femoris decreased or demonstrated no increase in muscular activity, but we have no information as to how that's actually relevant, because it's like, are these people doing, quote unquote, good morning squats and still the biceps femoris demonstrated no increase in muscular activity? That would be cool. That would be, quasi relevant information. But it's like, okay, if these people are squatting with, a traditional high bar, very vertical back, who is surprised that the biceps femoris demonstrated no increase in muscular activity, especially at this low of load? It's not entirely sure why it matters. Findings of the study, quadriceps do not vary. Yep, everyone's heard that. Glutes and biceps femoris are more active during the ascent phase of the squat. That's because most people naturally hip drive, even if they don't realize it, even if they're doing a high bar squat. This makes sense. Watch anybody get out of a chair. Traditional squat should have more hip flexion. See, this commentary, this type of stuff, he kind of splices it into his lit review. So he'll be talking about things within the lit review, and then he'll put in his own commentary here without making it, expressly clear that this is where he's putting in his own memes. A traditional squat should have more hip flexion compared to a non-traditional squat, which is funny because in his own version, the traditional squat has actually less hip flexion. His non-traditional squat has a much more closed hip angle, larger gluteus maximus and biceps femoris activity. So he's contradicted himself a few times in here with his specific language. I think he should have used two terms for his squats as opposed to traditional and non-traditional, because again, he's comporting this or trying to comport it with other people's information. The effects of back squat of different foot positions and angles on the lower muscle extremity activity. 10 experienced males. We got a wide stance and narrow stance, 2 foot positions, so 0 or 30 degrees abducted. 30 degrees is about the angle of which starting strength moment analysis tends to enjoy. There were no differences in muscle activities between the 2 foot positions. However, it determined that significant muscle differences in activity between the narrow stance and the wide stance squat. What essentially is the point? So the question here is, what is the point of shoving the toes out? The point of shoving the toes out is to allow the knees to come out as well. When the knees come out as well, the adductors are going to be lengthened more quickly, and then they're going to provide some more muscle mass involved in it. So if you look at Greg Knuckles' article, the adductors and how used they are in the squat, I'll be able to send that to you. It's very good. Starting strength has been saying that for years. The adductors get lengthened at the bottom of the squat and they contract. Surprise, they're used in the squat. But the reason why this is relevant is that we don't have any sort of bearing or any sort of visual moniker as to, hey, are these people actually shoving their knees out? You can have your toes, abducted to the cows come home, and then keep your knees to the front and then not really use your adductors to just put some more strain on your ankle. So between the wide and the narrow stance squat, this makes sense. The narrow stance squat is going to have a higher gastrocnemius activity. That's because the knees are going to go more forward because the femurs are now longer. The biomechanics, lift or shift to the anterior region of the frontal plane, non-traditional squat using the shoulder width stance. Center of gravity shifts forward. The center of pressure concurrently shifts forward because the vertical force that runs through. Yeah, so basically he's saying that if your center of pressure and the center of gravity are different, you have to move. Excellent analysis. Doesn't really tell us anything. Differences activation for the gluteus maximus. So we have VM, VL, BF, GM, 10 experienced lifters performing squat at 3 different depths discovered that as depth increased, so did the activity of the gluteus maximus during the ascent phase of the lift. Okay, the glute max demands are going to be larger as the glute max demand. This is the thing that I'm having I'm having trouble with, because this is not necessarily being presented as evidence for anything, but it's just like, yes, it's like you're going to use your glute max more as you get deeper in the squat. So it's like, yes, a lot of these things, if it sounds like I'm having a snarky attitude towards them, it's like, yes, so you told me that 2 + 2 is 4. Cool, I'm totally with you here. But I don't see why it's hyper relevant to the arguments that I'm proposing, which is why I may seem a little bit butt frustrated and a little bit jaded. So we have our biceps femoris, vastus medialis, and vastus lateralis. They didn't show any significant difference in activity between these 3 squat depths. Vastus medialis, yes, this makes sense. Vastus lateralis, yes, this makes sense, because if you remember in some of the earlier lit review things, he's saying that quad activation doesn't really change regardless of stance, yada yada, because the knee extension demands are going to be pretty similar, because it's going to be all of the weight above the knee is going to be a knee extension demand. So in these types of squats where you're having relatively vertical backs, yes, these demands are going to be relatively similar. The activation is you're going to get there pretty soon. The biceps femoris, though, in particular, it's a different case, because when you're doing a different type of squat, the moment arm analysis demand on the biceps femoris is different. On the knee, it's relatively similar. Increasing squat depth is to induce muscle activity in gluteus maximus. Totally makes sense. I totally agree with that. If we can even agree with the concept that muscle activity can change depending on form, because that's what the sentence says, so it's like squat depth is our variable, which is a function of technique and form. If we can conceptually agree that the gluteus maximus can change in muscle activity depending on a change in form and technique, then why conceptually can we not say that the hamstrings and the back extension demands are going to be changing depending on form and technique? This is kind of the little mental gymnastics hiccup that I'm having when having this conversation with you, but also with a lot of people who kind of poo-poo the moment arm analysis, where it's just like, there's a lot of things in this paper that if you just take that concept and apply it to sentences outside of the paper, it holds water, and it's still completely true. Since squat depth is not a variable to study, any differences in gluteus maximus muscle will be attributed to a factor other than squat depth. That's interesting. Not really sure how to feel about that. The next one's kind of, voluntary contraction speeds. That's something that I'm interested in, but I don't know too much about it yet. I know a decent bit, but not anything to, make the keystone of my arguments. So once we're done talking about the biceps femoris, yada, lower back activity and load, this was interesting. So if I'm very interested to see how they're measuring and attributing fatigue. Very unsure about that one in the low back load from the Sasaki study. The thing that was interesting to me was changing lifting technique does not decrease low back load. Because again here, without being incredibly explicit as to what type of squat they're doing, I don't really know what this means. So changing technique can be a cue. So it can be like, I want you to think about your knees during the squat, push through your knees or push through your hips. Those are considerations of changing your lifting technique, but this may not actually change the position that they're in. And then I'm not entirely sure about the machines that you're using. So we have an isometric muscle force analyzer and some other things. The design of that machine, as well as the specific movement they're going to be doing, has been affirmed multiple times throughout this paper and a bazillion other ones to impact and alter muscle activation in EMG. So it's just like your pecs aren't as incredibly activated as anyone could say during a Bulgarian split squat. No one will contend this. They're more activated during a bench. If we can agree with that, then we can agree that the hamstrings are doing something in the bent over low bar back squat. It's just like, it's if you can agree that the hamstrings are doing something in a good morning, okay, do a good morning, and then now bend your knees. Congratulations, you've done SS low bar back squat. And then now he starts to get into load during non-traditional squats. So lower extremity, this one was basically just a lot of truisms too. So it's like, yes, trunk activity is higher whenever squats are being performed on a Bosu ball. Cool. Totally agree with that. Vastus lateralis muscle activity was higher when squats were performed on a Smith machine. Sure, that makes sense. It's because you can press in a not straight and direct angle. So your knee extension doesn't have to really be as thoughtful. You can place a significantly higher amount of moment on the knee. Part of the reason, here we go, this is funny, the soleus had significantly higher activity on unstable discs. Wow. Traditional and non-traditional squats, this is his commentary again. So this is the interesting one. So we're on 25 now. A study comprised of 10 male athletes performing 3 different types of squats: normal squats, knee push squats, and hip drive squats. And it's funny because for me, I normally assume that knee push squats are the normal squat versus hip drive squats. Knee push squats emphasize knee joint movement without moving the hip position back and forth, which would shift the weight farther of the toes. That's not inherently true. You can move your hips back without putting the weight onto your toes. You can move your hips forward without putting the weight on your heels. The bar just moves up, causing a forward lean compared to normal squats or hip drive squats. Hip drive squats emphasize hip joint movement while keeping the knee joint position fixed. This is also not true. During the proper hip drive squat, the hips go up vertically. Since the hips are attached to the knee position comes back. So this sentence right here would imply that yes, we do go onto the toes, because if we have to keep the knee fixed in space and time, I'm now trading the length of the femur segment by moving the hip forward. No one does this. This is virtually impossible unless someone is behind you pushing you forward during your squat. This is a pants on head retarded statement. Hip drive squats and traditional squats both de-emphasize knee movement anteriorly. I completely disagree with this because in his some of his analysis of the traditional squat, it's just a fucking normal high bar squat, which is very knee dominant. Study supports the hypothesis the glute max and the hamstring activity should increase when performing traditional squats. The reason that they don't increase whenever we get to his data is that the person's still relatively vertical and the bar is on C5, C6 for them. Or I mean, not the bar, but their torso is still relatively vertical and they're not really getting to full depth. That's why. So it's just like, oh, congratulations. So if we increase the distance between the ischial tuberosity and the front of the tibia and the person's leaned over and that angle is stretched, hamstrings are going to work more. It's entirely technique dependent. So, as a certified personal trainer, well, what a lad, what a lad. Now, if we go back to here, this is above parallel. Right now, this lifter is on his toes, even if he doesn't realize it. This lifter is on his toes. Now, this is an unweighted squat, so that's 12 pounds. So his centroid is basically where it is exactly all the time. When he's standing, it's 2 to 3 inches above his sacrum. When he's squatting, it's somewhere in the middle of his rib cage. He's on his toes right now. That's what I would consider. His knees are pointed forward. His toes are pointed forward. His belly is running into his thighs, preventing him from getting full depth, which is why the crease of his hip is, higher than his knee. His torso is still relatively vertical, and his, I'd bet bottom dollar if we were to find his ischial tuberosity to be somewhere around where my cursor is now. So it wouldn't be, pointed back to the wall behind you. And then if we go to his non-traditional squat, if we notice there's a decent amount of lumbar rounding here, his pelvis is still basically tucked under. The lifter is focusing on staying on his toes, which requires an active mental effort because we don't like doing that. It's just like your EMG data is going to be, yes, the person is focusing and using their calves a lot, and the rest is going to remain relatively similar. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, it's like when you have lifters this light moving weights that light, the centroid is going to be relatively similar to the unweighted version, So it's like 150-pound lifter with a 405-pound barbell on his back. So let's say whenever you're squatting mid-fours, we can basically represent the center of mass as the barbell because it dramatically outweighs you as much, which is why the moment arm analysis of a 10-rep max is incredibly different than that of a 1-rep max. In this situation, when you're doing, 10 RMs with 10 reps with 75% of your load, the centroid is not really going to move further to the barbell. So like if you were just to be uninformed, if you were to be a weenus, you would say, okay, well, whenever we have our load here, this is the center of gravity that we need to consider. The reason the lifter can stay on his toes is because his centroid is actually really it's a little bit further south of that because it's not really on his toes. The center of pressure is going to be about here, so it's like his centroid is basically there right now in line with that. But if you're saying that the rudimentary or a rather uninformed analysis could say, well, in this situation, lumbar demands didn't increase despite the distance between the load and his lumbar spine being pretty great, then lumbar moment arm must not be very tightly correlated with the moment arm analysis, which is just patently untrue. If you were to gauge this distance between his sacrum and his centroid, it's going to be incredibly similar, from this image to this image. It's going to be incredibly similar. Faults in reasoning like this are the reason why a lot of these exercise science papers, which talk about muscle activation and things like that, I don't consider to be very useful. I'm interested to hear your retorts on this. If you can make it through the entire thing, I will. I'll upload this to YouTube and just send you the link. Hopefully, you can watch it on your TV or something. And I'm sure some of this is very rambly, but bear with me. This is an unscripted, impromptu video. But yeah, excited to see ya. Going to set a bunch of PRs. That'll be fun.